It's late at night on a weekend. I have that chemistry assignment to complete, I think, but instead my mind drifts off to the fantasy world that I've been creating. I open up the Google document and slip into the mentality of my characters. Running around in old English-style messy streets watched over by looming castles. It's the cheesy high fantasy setting, sure, but there's a lovable romance to it, like an overbaked cake. Critics might say it's dry, but it still tastes sweet to me. I write short stories on the bus, draft poems in between math practice sets, and hassle my friends for their feedback in creative writing club. Creative writing is an open-ended prose or poetic construction that is intended to entertain rather than to impart information, and it comes in three main categories: creative nonfiction, poetry, and fiction. I love all three mediums a lot, but more than anything, fiction is my home. And fiction is my home because it's so freeing and it stretches my imagination, but more than anything, I find it fun. It's sheer joy to me, and I want to share that joy with others. And that's the same reason why it comes as a disappointment to find that the underclassmen English programs don't often offer creative writing and fiction as a class assignment or educational opportunity. More so, they focus on skills like rhetoric or argumentation. I truly believe that creative writing and fiction specifically has so much power and potential as an educational opportunity for students to learn social, English, and moral education. And now, I shall proceed to use all those skills the underclassmen English program painstakingly imparted in me about argumentation and rhetoric to talk about why maybe those same skills should step out of the limelight and share it with fiction. In my research, I discovered esteemed teacher Harold Kieber, who has been teaching in Denver public school systems for the past 30 years. He was also Life magazine's Teacher of the Year in 1960. He wrote in the English Journal that it is mostly college-bound 11th and 12th graders taking his creative writing class, with the occasional sophomore. And from this, we can see that creative writing and fiction isn't an opportunity regularly offered to underclassmen students. Now, that was 60 years ago, and things have changed since then. But just take a look at any of the standardized examinations that schools are obligated to prepare underclassmen for when they take it in their upperclassmen years, be it the American SATs and APs, international IBs, or British GCSEs and A-levels. You'll be hard-pressed to find a creative writing or fiction examination. This is not to say that creative writing and fiction necessarily needs to be in those standardized tests, but only to say that we can clearly see where the priorities of schools lie. Personally, my school only offers one proper opportunity for freshmen and sophomores to write fiction, and two opportunities in total for them to write creatively. And as a writer, that's exhausting. I truly believe that fiction has so much potential as an educational opportunity, but every time I choose to write a story on the bus when I really should have just been taking a much-needed nap, or writing a poem when I really should have just been focusing exclusively on my math, it reminds me that I'm making a sacrifice between my passions and my obligations in schools. And that really tires me. High school is still tiring. A big part of why I wrote this speech is just because I wanted to stand up for that one kid sitting at the back of the classroom, working on their epic fantasy romance novel, while the teacher is working on simple and complex sentences at the front of the classroom. In that same 60-year-old study by the English Journal, Harvard professor Edwin H. Sauer commented that there is little value in the able college-bound student in learning creative writing. In fact, there is a great deal of harm if he picks up an easygoing impressionism about all writing and thus aggressively resists the disciplines of exposition and persuasion. Now, you can tell that this quote is a little bit outdated because the default for a college student is a he. But aside from that, you can also see that fiction and creative writing in high schools is so disregarded. Why? If school is meant to only prepare you for the skills that you will directly use in the future, then I guess it makes sense. After all, how often do working adults use skills such as writing character development arcs or magic systems in their day-to-day lives? Unless you work in the fiction industry, I'd wager not much. This is what Dr. Harvard was talking about. But remember, that was 60 years ago. The true power in fiction lies in something that's really fundamental. These worlds, these people, these stories, they aren't real. Yeah, duh, that's really obvious, but there's a true power in that. Our world is changing, and freeing up the boundaries of education is the vehicle for the mindset of our students to change with it. That's why liberal arts is such a popular education outlook nowadays in the United States, one that the Association of Colleges and Universities in America describes as interdisciplinary and experiential. Experiential learning is learning by doing, by really diving headfirst into the change you wish to see in the world and making that happen as a learning experience. And I want to focus on experiential learning because that's exactly what fiction is. Princeton psychologist Diana Tamir discovered that reading fiction gives you better social cognition. Well, sort of. So in her study, participants were first made to take a test measuring their empathy levels, and then read a fiction story, and then take another test measuring how emotionally connected they were to the story. As researchers were exiting the room, they dropped a few pens. It was found that the participants that felt more emotional connection to the story were more likely to pick up those pens. What's special about this is that reading itself doesn't make you a better person because all the participants read the same story. It is instead the amount of emotional connection with the text that you actually feel that delivers the moral and social education. And fiction writing ups the amp on this. After all, the emotional connection to a story you have is so much higher when you're actually penning it instead of just reading it. When students create characters, they have to spend time wondering how this character thinks and speaks, to write about someone else's emotions, or even to feel them. We only have one pair of eyes, one pair of ears, and one perspective. While it very much feels like the world revolves around us, it doesn't. And fiction offers the unique perspective to take us out of that continuum. Because at the end of the day, when we write fiction, our world revolves around someone else. When freshmen come into high school, they are instantly challenged to take on tough and multifaceted problems in society, be it totalitarianism, wealth and power that corrupts, or systemic oppression. When I came into this school, the very first book I read was Night by Elie Wiesel, which is a semi-autobiographical book about his experiences in the Holocaust. It doesn't underestimate the ruler, and it doesn't underestimate the reader, and is a brutally honest retelling about his experiences in the Jewish genocide. The very next year, I read The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas, about the life-threatening racism that can explode in any normal American town. Of Mice and Men, The Great Gatsby, The Crucible, all of these are very popular choices in high school fiction and literature. And all of these take on difficult themes, rightfully so. From the moment freshmen enter high school, they're immediately challenged to understand these topics through analysis, debate, and essay writing. But that's all through the role of an observer. To write fiction, students cannot afford to be just observers. They really have to grasp the governmental system or the world that they want to study and interpret it or come up with it themselves. Imagine a student discussing with their teacher how they want to portray totalitarianism and over-surveillance and what they want to say about it. Isn't this so much better than just reading about it in 1984? Now, don't get me wrong. I don't think a high schooler is going to write the next 1984. At least, I don't think so. But at the end of the day, what that high schooler takes away is a closeness and a deep understanding and emotional connection to the story they wrote and the systems that they wrote in the story, because at the end of the day, it's theirs, and no one can take that away from them. This is ownership, one of the fundamentals in experiential learning. Angela M. Passarelli and David A. Kolb of Case Western University discovered that students develop subconscious identities about how they learn. You either have a fixed identity, where you believe your abilities are fixed, you can't grow and you can't change. Or you have a learning identity, where you believe that you can learn and you can grow and you can change. Unsurprisingly, students with learning identities were more able to be flexible and take on more challenges, thus learning better. This is the power of ownership. Now, that was a lot of educational jargon, but essentially it means that students who believe in themselves are able to learn better. That's why ownership is important, because students can look back at how far they've come and say, well, that was me. And fiction writing offers this unique ownership because they wrote the story, and that's so important. And this kind of education is so urgent in today's world. Just look at it. COVID-19, rising social fractures, oppression, hate crimes, increased climate disasters. We are no longer in an era where students only need to understand what a writer 90 years ago said in their magnum opus literary work. No. As a young person living in these times, I demand that the next generation get the kind of education that forces them to really think about what they want to say, that really forces them to figure out how to solve problems, even in a fictional context, instead of just analyzing it, so that we have a fighting chance for the future. But aside from that, writing is also something that is deeply personal. When I write, I start subconsciously mimicking the actions of my characters. For example, I'll just be typing, writing my story, and say my character shakes someone's hands. I'll take out my hand and I'll intensely stare at it, figure out every muscle and every way of shaking my hand, and then I'll write it. Or say my character sees someone in the distance. So I'll be typing, right? And then I'll turn my head with my character and kind of feel how the other person approaches, imagine it, and then I'll write it. I think my parents think I'm really weird when I write, but I've just accepted that. But from this, we can see that writing has always been something that is intensely, intensely personal. And it's helped me through many, many personal problems. So I used to study in Singapore in local school. For 8 years of my life, actually, an incredibly long time. And in Singapore, we use a slang known as Singlish. It was and still is my primary form of expression. My friends in local school like to describe me as a disgruntled auntie, one that I was very disgruntled to find out about. But coming to this international school, I was stripped of that form of communication. I mean, why use a slang that no one else around you understands? Don't get me wrong, I could still speak English. I could just delete all of the Singlish from my vocabulary. But I couldn't truly express myself. It was like there was a wall of expression that I couldn't break through. But I will always remember the day I stepped into Creative Writing Club for the very first time. When the eccentric Dr. Seuss-like club president, who, if you want a visual on this, just imagine a very, very long human being with a mop of blonde hair at the top. He read out my piece for the first time to a whole room of people that politely clapped. And it felt like, for the very first time in this school, that wall had been chipped. And that meant so much to me. What I didn't know then was that those people in the room, the upperclassmen, ended up giving me the best high school advice I have ever gotten in my life. And the peers in that room, they're my closest friends today. From this, at least in my experience, fiction writing, because I mostly wrote fiction in that class, is something that is so intensely personal and connective. At the end of the day, I strongly believe that writing fiction allows students not just to tell a story, but to truly express themselves in a way that, ironically, can't be put into words. And that's the true power of fiction. Because after I spend 10 minutes agonizing over 2 words in a short story, and this happens way too often, I'm back to doing that chemistry assignment due tomorrow 10 a.m. But in that time that I've taken to write something fictional, I've gained some soft skills: creativity, sensitivity, a new perception of the historical era that my story is likely set in. Fiction isn't just an escapism or just a hobby or just something fun that people do. Instead, it gives us space to take a deep breath, to prepare for the next battle, and to gain a new perspective. Essentially, you can think of it as a meaningful recess from reality. Thank you.